this is your last lecture you will be hearing from me. Woohoo! So let's get into it. Homeostasis in hormones and reproduction will be the three things that we're talking about today. So please take notes while you're watching this lecture, and please answer the questions on the Ed Puzzle as you go. This is worth 20 points. The notes should be uploaded to ManagePack, and then just make sure you watch this video all the way to the end so it's 100% viewed. Okay, here we go. Homeostasis. So if we're going to talk about hormones or the endocrine system in reproduction, we first need to talk about homeostasis. Homeostasis is maintaining stability in the internal environment of the body between specific limits. So basically it's trying to keep your internal environment at a balance. And there's a bunch of glands in your body, as you can see in this picture, that are going to help you get there, like the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the adrenal gland, your pancreas, your ovaries, your testicles. Those are all ways that our body is trying to maintain homeostasis between specific limits. So we have a norm. For example, our body temperature should be at a specific norm, our blood pH, our carbon dioxide levels, our blood glucose levels, and our water balance. If these things are not between those limits, then we've passed a threshold and we can potentially become very sick and die. So there's different glands in our bodies to help release hormones to try to control those things and bring them back to balance if they start to go beyond those limits. So we call it the endocrine system, and it consists of glands that release hormones that are transported in the blood. So these hormones that we're going to talk about, these chemical signals, are transported through our bloodstream. So hormones are working in the form of a negative feedback mechanism or a negative feedback loop. So when we talk about the word negative here, I want you to think about a number line. So look down here in this bottom corner. If there's so our body wants to be at zero. It wants to be at a balance. It wants to be safe. But if something starts to go wrong, it might increase. For example, our temperature increases on the positive side of the number line. A hormone is going to be sent to try to counteract that and bring it back to zero. So it brings it back down the negative side, in a sense. It takes it negative back to zero. And that's why we call it a negative feedback loop. It's a loop trying to get you back to zero. So you might go positive for a while, but then you're going to start heading in the negative direction. So don't think of negative as bad. Think of negative as like decreasing. So there's a few vocab terms when you talk about a negative feedback loop, and so this picture will show you the whole process. So let's say there's an imbalance right here. So what's going to happen is the set point, which is usually a constant value that your body wants to stay at, so picture body temperature maybe, is all of a sudden constrained. Something is pushing it past its limit. So there's going to be a change detected by a receptor. The receptor is going to be the sensor that takes in this stimuli, and they're going to send a message to the control center. So the control center is going to receive this information, and then it's going to send out an effector. An effector is a mechanism for taking action. They're going to be the ones that return, so usually the hormone, which is going to return that variable back to its set point. So it releases something, maybe a hormone, and that brings us back to homeostasis. So it's a negative feedback loop. Positive in the sense of the effect increasing, but then decreases back to zero. Homeostasis, there are a couple examples of that. One of them is thermoregulation. So thermoregulation is our temperature being regulated. So our set body temperature is about 37 degrees Celsius. The sensors in our body are your blood and your body temperature, and their temperature above and below 38 degrees Celsius. So when your body senses that you have gone above or below this, it starts to send a signal. Your control center for your temperature is the hypothalamus in your brain. So here's a picture of it here. In the hypothalamus, thermostat has a sensitivity to your blood temperature, so how hot you are, and as well as it's connected to your pituitary gland, which has to do with these hormones down here. But in the sense of your body temperature, the hypothalamus is going to be sending a message to your thyroid gland right here, and it's going to send out T3 and T4, which have to do with their iodine, amount of iodine in them, and they send out these hormones, T3 and T4, to affect your metabolism. So if you're hot or if you're too cold, like say you fell in a lake that's covered in ice, it's going to make you start shivering. So it impacts your metabolism, which affects your temperature. Just to kind of throw into, so you can see down here, there's the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, which are in charge of releasing GH hormone, which is growth hormone that makes you grow taller when you need to, or cell growth when you need more cells developed. And then posterior pituitary, which releases ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, which helps you hold in water so you don't become dehydrated. So your hypothalamus is in charge of a few things. And it's attached to your thyroid gland and then your anterior and posterior pituitary gland. But this is an example of your body trying to regulate its temperature using a hormone, your thyroid gland, and releasing T3 and T4 hormone. So here's the response to each situation. So response to overheating or response to chilling. So you can see that the vasodilation, which is when your skin arterioles become wider, will increase heat loss. So skeletal muscles will remain relaxed and a decrease in heat generation will occur. So basically your body will start sweating, which will pull that heat away from you with the water. If you are too cold, vasoconstriction occurs, and this is going to decrease heat loss. So skeletal muscles are going to cause rapid contractions, which we call shivering, and this will increase heat because you're shivering. There'll be no sweating, so it'll decrease heat loss. So this is your body trying to create a negative feedback loop and trying to maintain your body temperature. So now let's take more examples using hormones. So we said that the hypothalamus interacts with the thyroid gland, which is here around your neck. And the hormone that it releases is thyroxine. So it's secreted by the thyroid gland. It regulates your metabolic rate, and it helps control your body temperature. Remember we said that, you can see down here, the hormone it releases is T3 and T4, which has to do with an amount of iodine in your body. The thyroid gland requires iodine in the diet. So if you don't have the proper amount of iodine in your diet, you've maybe seen someone who has something called a goiter right here in their neck, and that's because they are lacking enough iodine in their diet. So this is occurring around their thyroid gland. So a lack of thyroxine, or this hormone thyroxine, causes lack of energy, depression, weight gain, despite appetite loss. So you maybe aren't eating, but you're still gaining weight, and feeling cold, because the thyroid gland and thyroxine are part of controlling your metabolism. Another type of negative feedback loop, or homeostasis, that occurs in our body is control of glucose blood levels. So our set blood glucose levels is 90 milligrams over 100 milliliters. That's what our body is looking for. So when the pancreas senses that glucose levels are too high or too low, it's going to create a certain effect. And it's going to have beta and alpha cells, which are in the pancreas, release insulin, which are beta cells. Beta cells release insulin, and glucogen, which is what alpha cells release. So this is where our pancreas is. Remember, we talked about this in our digestive system. It's near the stomach, and it releases a lot of enzymes for digestion. Well, it's also really important in controlling your sugar levels. So insulin, which remember I said comes from beta cells, when it's secreted, it helps lower your blood sugar. When the alpha cells release glucagon, this is going to help raise your blood sugar if it's too low. So here are some pictures of an example. So this pathway is showing you if you have low blood glucose. So the pancreas is going to, if you have low sugar levels, the pancreas will tell the alpha cells to release glucagon. The liver will then release glucose into the blood, which will then achieve normal blood glucose levels because you needed more glucose. Where in this case, you have too much sugar in your blood, so the pancreas is going to have the beta cells release insulin, which then the insulin triggers fat cells to take in sugar from your blood, and then you achieve normal blood glucose levels. Diabetes is the reduced ability to control your blood glucose through insulin. So there's two types of diabetes. So type 1, which is early onset, or type 2, which is adult onset. So type 1 would be hereditary, and there's a weak relationship. So what that means is it's usually triggered by an illness. So for example, your beta cells are destroyed, which would normally release insulin, maybe through cancer or some sort of disease happening in your body. And insulin production stops because of this. So in this case, if you have high blood glucose levels, the glucose will stimulate the pancreas, but the pancreas does not produce enough insulin. So there's not enough insulin to stimulate the fat cells to take in glucose. So that means you'll still have a high blood glucose levels. So someone with diabetes, early onset, would need to get insulin injections. Adult onset for type 2 diabetes would be hereditary as well. There's a stronger relationship, though, between it being hereditary, and it's related to obesity and poor diet. So fewer insulin receptors maybe are in the liver is what's occurring, and less sensitivity to insulin. So insulin does not work that well on the body. So having insulin injections here may not even help. So glucose what you're seeing here is you have high blood sugar levels. The insulin will stimulate the pancreas. The pancreas will produce insulin, but the insulin does not stimulate cells. So there's maybe too few receptors. So that means the liver does not take in any glucose for the bloodstream, and then it just stays very high. So remember, type 2 may not be benefiting with insulin injections where type 1 would. Okay, another hormone we're going to talk about is leptin. Leptin is secreted by your adipose tissue cells, which are basically your fat cells. If you look in this picture here, it's below your skin. A few layers down into your skin are your fat cells. And the fat cells are basically triggering when they're full. They trigger to release the hormone leptin to tell your body to stop eating, to inhibit appetite. So they basically send a message to your control center, which is your hypothalamus in this case. And then the hypothalamus says, all right, we're not hungry anymore. So leptin is, to define it, a protein hormone that targets the appetite center of the hypothalamus. Food intake triggers leptin secretion, which in turn is going to inhibit your appetite, which reduces food intake. So this is a negative feedback loop because you're eating, and then your fat cells or your adipose tissue cells say you're full, so leptin is released or secreted, and that tells your hypothalamus to tell your brain you're not hungry anymore. There was a time in the early or the late 90s when they were thinking that leptin could help, taking leptin injections would potentially help with obesity. So there were some studies done on mice here, and you can tell here is a mice that its leptin receptors were blocked. So you can see how large he was. And then here is a healthy mouse. And what they did was they connected their blood circulation between these two mice. So they were attached. And there were two different situations. Leptin deficit, which here's the obese mouse and the healthy mouse. And the healthy mouse's leptin would circulate into the obese mouse's bloodstream as well. And you could see that the obese mouse started to become a healthy weight level. In this scenario, This is where it was receptor deficit. So they removed the receptors or blocked the leptin receptors in the obese mouse. And so even though the blood with leptin was traveling from the healthy mouse into the obese mouse, because they were blocked, it couldn't help the obese mouse. So he stayed obese, and actually the healthy mouse started to become emaciated, so really, really skinny, because there was so much leptin in the bloodstream, it told his body to not eat at all. So he started to become skinny. From this research here, the leptin deficit, they were thinking maybe with humans this would be a good way to help with obesity. But what they found when they gave leptin to people, that it didn't actually help with their weight loss. So maybe their bodies were just not, they were not being stimulated by the leptin, like their hypothalamus wasn't, to tell them to stop or to inhibit their appetite. But they also started to break out in skin rashes. So this was decided it was not a good way to help with obesity issues. But leptin does naturally in our bodies help to inhibit our appetite when our adipose tissues tell us we're full. And the last hormone we're going to talk about before the reproduction system is melatonin. Melatonin is secreted by the pineal gland, which the pineal gland is here in your brain, and it helps control your circadian rhythms. So high levels of melatonin causes the feeling of drowsiness and promotes sleep. So usually when you're sleeping is when your body starts to produce or secrete melatonin. So you can see in this graph, during the waking hours or the hours where we're awake, there is not a lot of melatonin in our bloodstream. But then in the sleeping hours, there's a huge increase of it. And then back again when you wake up, it decreases, and back again when you're asleep, it increases. So it follows your daily patterns. So melatonin is sometimes advertised as a treatment for jet lag. Why do you think it might work? So jet lag, usually the issue is that your body is off track because you've flown through different time zones, and your melatonin is being released at a time when your body now thinks it should be awake because you're in a new time zone. Or you know you should be awake, but your body doesn't realize that yet because it hasn't synced back up with the time zone. So what some people will do is you can take melatonin pills. They're sold usually at a pharmacy, and they can help you if you take them when you first arrive in a new time zone. It can help, and before you go to sleep with the new time zone, it'll help you feel drowsy and fall asleep at the correct time in that new time zone that you're in, and help your body get back on track faster. All right, so the last part, reproduction of the topic 6.6. So in this picture here, this is an egg, and these are a bunch of sperm approaching the egg, trying to fertilize it. If you remember from meiosis, these would be called gametes. So this would be a picture of a microscope where you can actually see, here's the egg, and here is one sperm about to fertilize this egg. So gametes, remember, are haploid sex cells, so they're only half the amount of information needed to make a diploid zygote. So a zygote would be once the egg and the sperm have come together, and they make a unique combination, a mixture of the two's genetics, and it makes a unique zygote. We call that fertilization. Before we get into, so we've talked about egg and sperm and the fact that they're gametes, but we need to talk about where they come from. One of the things you'll need to be able to do on the test is identify or label on a diagram different parts of the male and female reproductive structure. So in this picture here, I've highlighted the ones you need to know. So this is following the sperm's journey. So before it can be released, it has to be made. So the testes is where spermatogenesis occurs, which means basically where the sperm are created. So there's hormones or testosterone that are being released by the testes, and this is creating sperm. The epididymis is where the sperm are going to mature, which is right here behind the testes wall. The vas deferens is a tube, and it goes all the way around here, which is where the sperm is going to be transported from the epididymis before ejaculation. There are other areas called the prostate gland and the seminal vesicles, which is what's going to create the fluid and also the fluid that has nutrients in it for the sperm to stay alive, as well as fluid to help counteract the pH of the vagina so the sperm can survive when it's in there. So the prostate gland and the seminal vesicle are in charge of the fluids, so the mucus and fluids. And then the penis is in charge of ejaculation of the sperm. So this is the path that the sperm will take using the male reproductive structure. So let's talk about that hormone that I mentioned, since we're still in the endocrine system, that the testes produces, which is testosterone. This is a picture here of two elephant seals off the coast of Canada. The US, Canada, and Mexico is where this occurs. There's really only about 40 females to reproduce with, so they are a limiting factor. So the males are competing for their affection, basically, so that they can reproduce with them here in this picture, and they go to war, basically. So what testosterone does, it does a couple things. First of all, it's going to be the prenatal development of the male genitalia, and this is caused because of the Y chromosome. Remember, a male is XY, and so the Y chromosome is what's going to tell the body that it has testosterone, and it's going to use that testosterone to produce a boy and the male genitalia. So it also will promote development of secondary sexual characteristics. And when I say secondary, this means it's going to come when you go through puberty. So these characteristics will arrive then. So like the larynx growth, so what's going to make your voice sound deeper, facial, body, and pubic hair, muscle and bone development, and then male behavior patterns, which usually is an increased in aggression level because of testosterone, and then maintenance of the sex drive. So I just went through these with you. Let's look at functions of estrogen. So functions of estrogen, this would be the female hormone. There's also another one that we don't talk about as often, but it has to do with the pregnancy and the cycle of the menstrual cycle. So estrogen and progesterone cause prenatal development of female reproductive organs. So this would be if you are an XX, they're part of the X chromosome. And they are also they're going to be what gives the prenatal development as well as the secondary sexual characteristics that will occur during puberty. And they also are going to be controlling the negative and positive feedback loops or mechanisms involved in the ovarian and pituitary hormones that control the menstrual cycle. These would be the secondary sex characteristics of females. So maturation of ovaries, so maturing of the ovaries, enlargement of the vagina and uterus. So this is basically saying that the female is ready to reproduce. The widening of the pelvis in order for it to be safe for her to give birth. Growth of pubic hair and under armpit hair. Monthly ovulation and menstruation. And then changes in behavior associated with sex drive. Here are the female reproductive structures that you would need to know. So what you're looking at here is these are the ovaries. So this would be the key to the hormone that's being released, estrogen and progesterone, as well as where the eggs or the gametes are going to be at for the female. These are the fallopian tubes on either side. So there's two ovaries, notice, two fallopian tubes. An egg, usually they switch off. So when one per each month, one egg is released each menstrual cycle, and it's going to come down here into the uterus, and it's going to attach to the lining or not. If it doesn't attach, it'll just discharge during the menstrual cycle. This is where the baby would grow. This is the cervix, which would become dilated during the birth as the baby is about to breach or come out. And then this is the vagina where the sperm or semen is going to enter. The endometrium here this is the lining, which is the lining that's going to be filled with nutrients and blood and be protective if an egg attaches. But if it doesn't, this is what's going to be shed during a menstrual cycle, is the endometrium. Okay, the menstrual cycle. So the purpose of the menstrual cycle is to release an egg for possible fertilization and implementation in the uterus. Each cycle is going to last 28 days. All egg cells are created before birth. So remember, we talked about this before, but a female has as many eggs as she's going to have for her entire life by the time she's born. And we start losing them pretty fast, actually, because even after we're born, some of them, they break down and they are never usable. But then once we hit puberty and mature, that's when we start releasing these eggs. So a premature egg cell we call an oocyte, and this is going to develop into a follicle. So you can see here is the ovary, and this would be the cycle here is what it's showing you before it goes into the fallopian tube. So we have the premature egg, an oocyte, which is developing here into a follicle. That's what this is around it, is a follicle. At the right moment, the egg will be released into the fallopian tube, and the follicle will slowly, which is protecting it, will slowly turn into a corpus luteum, which this corpus luteum is going to trigger the release of other hormones that are going to help protect the egg as it travels down into the uterus. So there's 4 hormones we're going to talk about. The hormone released from the anterior pituitary gland is FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone. So you must know it has to do with that follicle I just showed you in the picture. So it's going to stimulate the growth of the follicle, and it stimulates secretion of estrogen. So usually its role comes in the beginning, mostly, of the process of the 28-day cycle. LH, which stands for luteinizing hormone, stimulates ovulation. So it stimulates conversion of the empty follicle to the corpus luteum. So you can see this is coming into play more towards the end of the 28-day cycle. And it stimulates secretion of estrogen and progesterone by the corpus luteum, which is going to help within pregnancy. So hormones released from the ovaries. So these are the 2 we talked about, estrogen and then progesterone, which is actually released from the corpus luteum. So estrogen stimulates repair and growth of the endometrium, which is the uterus lining that'll be shed each month during the period if no egg attaches. It is in charge of the negative feedback loop on the pituitary to block FSH, and the positive feedback loop on pituitary to release LH. When I say positive feedback loop, basically it just means it keeps increasing and never comes back to balance. So as in the negative feedback loop is going to come back to 0, this one will just keep increasing. Progesterone is released from the corpus luteum. It stimulates the final growth of the uterine lining at the end, and it's part of the negative feedback loop on the pituitary to block FSH and LH if need be. This is usually if a woman becomes pregnant, you no longer need FSH and LH to be increasing or decreasing because your body doesn't need to go through the menstrual cycle each month, at least for now. This picture is showing you it all in one time. So here is you can see on the bottom, there is the 1 through 28 days, and you can see the endometrial lining of the uterus, how it grows, and you can see it becomes pretty thick or by the 15th day and onward before it's shed. You can see that estrogen is more increased in the earlier stages of the cycle, and progesterone increases in the second stage. Here you can see that the FSH increases in the beginning. I know it's very slight, but it does. And then it decreases, and then there's a slight increase in the middle, and then it decreases again. Where the LH is going to stay pretty stable, and then it just increases around the 15th day, and then decreases again, or continuously decreases. So this is showing all of those hormones in one picture. So William Harvey was one of the first scientists to break through on sexual reproduction for a long time, because what we believed was Aristotle's theory here, which Aristotle said that the seed came from the man in semen, and it mixed with menstrual blood of the female, and this seed from the male created an egg. But it was fully made from basically it came from the man's seed. And then this is where the baby grew from, was this egg. But he made it sound very much like it was just from the male, and the menstrual blood was kind of like a soil that helped give it nutrients. This was accepted for a very long time until William Harvey proposed this. He proposed that all life comes from the egg, which he didn't know for sure because he wasn't able to visually see it, because microscopes were not invented until 17 years after his death. So he was doing his research based only off of what the human eye could see. And he did a lot of his research with deer. And basically, what he found was that after there was no embryo present until about 7 weeks after fertilization had occurred. And he did incorrectly state that the egg and the sperm were both, he said that the egg and the sperm were not the seeds of what created an embryo. So he was incorrect there because he believed it was just the egg that created it. But now we know that it's a mixture of the two, that it's an egg and the sperm that create the embryo or the zygote. But he was the first one to kind of debunk Aristotle's theory. Okay. In vitro fertilization. So sometimes the reproductive system doesn't work for everyone, and there is the possibility of still having children through in vitro fertilization, or IVF. So this is how IVF works. Basically, after determining if someone is suitable for IVF, so they need to go to a doctor and see if they're a suitable candidate for it, the FSH and LH hormones are given to stimulate multiple egg releases. So they actually are going to give some drugs first to the female to make her normal cycle stop. And then once it has, they're going to give lots of FSH and LH to stimulate tons of eggs to be released at once, which isn't natural for the body to do. But because of this increased amount of hormone, it releases multiple eggs. These eggs are then removed from the female, and then the eggs are fertilized with the father's sperm in a dish outside of the body, and they're incubated. So this is called in vitro fertilization. So we're down here at step 4. So they're incubated here. After incubation, viable or fertilized blastocytes, so once these eggs have started to, and sperm have come together and they've started to divide into multiple cells, that's called a blastocyte. The blastocyte is selected and then inserted into the female's uterus. Guidelines state that up to 3 embryos can be selected for implementation. So there is a potential of a risk of having multiple pregnancies at once, and this is why oftentimes when someone does in vitro fertilization, they may end up having 2 children or 3, not just 1. After bed rest in a month or so, a pregnancy test is administered. Not always bed rest though, but usually you have to have a very relaxed, calm. You want to make sure your body will accept these embryos, so you're not trying to do anything stressful. And after about a month, they'll do a pregnancy test, and if it's positive, the pregnancy will continue as normal, and the woman will give birth to her child. If not, a woman may wait a few months and attempt another cycle of this process. There are a lot of arguments for and against IVF. So here we would say arguments for the right to have children. It's a great technology that allows people who can't have children as easily have a second chance at it. Improving medical technologies has made it safer than ever before. Some governments will even cover the cost, like some insurances. And this gives hope to families that could not conceive by traditional means. Unused embryos can also be stored and used for later dates, or donated, or a source of stem cells. Arguments against IVF is religious reasons, maybe, saying it's playing God, saying that if you weren't able to have them, then that's just how it is, and that's what God has decided for you. The risk to the mother and fetus of multiple pregnancies could also be you're not taking into the consideration of the mother's body. Extreme costs can also be associated with IVF and put people in debt. Emotional costs of failure can be high, so it doesn't work the first time a lot of times. It might take up to 3-4 times, and that can put someone in debt, and also they just start to feel emotionally drained from it. So, and then does termination of excess embryos, because you are allowed to technically do that, count as ending a human life, and where is the line drawn? So there's a lot of arguments for and against IVF, and it's something that you have to think about for yourself if this was something that you wanted to be a candidate for in the future. And it kind of goes on what your values are and what your moral code is, so to speak. So I believe that's where we are ending this. I hope this was helpful in understanding homeostasis, hormones, and reproduction. And please make sure you submit your lecture notes to ManageBack, and I will see you in class.